Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Bureau of Justice Assistance, we welcome you to the Project Safe Neighborhoods webinar on targeting offenders and creating targeted offender lists. We want to thank you all for joining us today, particularly in light of the current situation with COVID-19. Thank you for all that you do to keep our communities safe. Today's webinar will consist of an interactive panel discussion on strategies for identifying prolific violent offenders and maintaining targeted offender lists. Prior to beginning today's webinar, please allow us to make a few other comments. This webinar is being recorded for the benefit of others who may view it later and will be posted on our PSN TTA website. Please place your phone on mute and not on hold during the presentation. We'll answer questions at the end of the webinar presentation. However, we encourage you to make your thoughts and questions known during the webinar. The presenter will answer questions that come in through the chat feature at several points throughout the webinar. The chat utility is on the right-hand side of your screen. If the chat utility is not displayed, hover your cursor over the webinar screen. Along the bottom of your screen, a row of bubbles should appear. Click on the message icon to activate the chat function. Following the webinar, you will receive a request to evaluate it. Please complete the evaluation and give us your honest thoughts and recommendations. If there are any topics you think we should cover on future webinars, please let us know. We'd like to thank the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Justice Assistance for their support of PSN, the TTA program, and today's webinar. Now on to today's webinar. Our speakers include Tom Woodmansey, Senior Advisor at the Center for Justice Research and Innovation at CNA, which is a TTA provider for the PSN, Scott Decker, a Senior Fellow at CNA, Brianna Fox, Associate Professor in the Department of Criminology at the University of South Florida, and Captain Paul Luzinski with the Tampa Police Department. To begin with, we will hear from Scott, who will provide an overview of the webinar and facilitate the discussion.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. I am excited about today's presentation because of the topic and its importance to our communities, its role in a Project Safe Neighborhoods response, as well as the colleagues who are joining me today who've been introduced, and in particular, the chance to hear from a site, Tampa, where things have gone extremely well, but there were some struggles along the way, and there were some opportunities to work through challenges, to design methods to be successful in kind of integrating a research partner with the team of law enforcement individuals who were working hard, as many of you are, all of you are, to reduce levels of violence in our communities. And so what we'd like you to do is, as Juliana mentioned, is please, if you have questions, post them on the chat function. There'll be opportunities at the end as well. A number of you have submitted questions already, and we've had a chance to review those and hope to answer them today. And if we don't get to all of them today, we'll be more than happy to provide responses in the days and weeks to come. So you can submit questions, you can raise your hand virtually, and also answer polls throughout the discussion. We have a number of poll questions that we're going to make available. We want to get your responses. They'll help us to design training and technical assistance to respond to questions and inquiries from the sites, and to do a better job, frankly, which is what we're always trying to do in responding to the challenges faced in our PSN communities, as well as within the PSN structure. Do take advantage, if you would, of the opportunity to submit questions and answer polls. I'll provide a brief introduction to the members of the panel, and there are four of us. Tom and myself have already been introduced. We're with CNA. You could reach us through the CNA site, as well as the other PSN resources. But the real outstanding, I think, contributions will come from our friends in Tampa, Captain Paul Luzinski in the Tampa Police Department, who will lay out the challenge faced in Tampa, a challenge most of us face, and that is levels of violent crime that are either rising or are at troublingly high levels that we and the community want to intervene and provide for safer opportunities for young people to grow up, for other people to live lives without fear of violence. And really that's a basic element of being successful in life. And Tampa is fortunate to have an individual whom many of us think is one of the best researchers engaging with practitioners in criminal justice, and that's Brianna Fox, who's a professor at the University of South Florida, who is a real integral member of the PSN team there. I want to turn the microphone, if you will, over to my colleague Tom Woodmansee at CNA. Tom was an officer and supervisor in the Madison Police Department, responsible for much innovation and a lot of creative work in responding to violent crime. And Tom's going to kick off the overview for today's webinar.
Great. Thanks, Scott. I appreciate it. I'm really pleased to be part of this webinar. And as you mentioned, I was a police officer prior to working with CNA, and I helped to develop and supervise a unit of detectives where we identified prolific violent offenders and applied strategies to them. So I've been fortunate enough to have been part of several webinars, but none with a better panel than we have for this, so I'm excited for us to kick off. Our team decided that we wanted to present our information in more of a Q&A panel style rather than a traditional PowerPoint lecture webinar presentation. And we've recently received, as Scott mentioned, a number of questions from you, which is great. So we're going to incorporate these questions, and they're going to drive our discussion. As we know, this is an important topic, and we obviously won't be able to cover all the related aspects of the offender list in an hour, but our hope is that you'll leave this webinar with not just some helpful insights on creating lists, but also what to do with them, which is often the most challenging aspect for law enforcement. Creating and managing lists is a topic that comes up with many agencies around the country looking to address those small percentages of individuals or groups that are driving their crime. This is especially noticed in relating to the various BGA programs such as PSN, the Public Safety Partnership, and SPI, the Strategies for Innovative Policing, where many agencies are utilizing lists to develop their approaches to reduce crime. So during this discussion, you'll see that we note a few key elements that need to be considered for establishing and operating an offender list, but none are more important than communicating and collaborating with a multitude of partners, from the patrol officer to the U.S. Attorney's Office. So we're very pleased to see that so many different agencies are represented on this webinar, and I think Juliana mentioned that we had around 180 people register for this, which is fantastic. So before we kick off on our first discussion slide, Juliana, do you want to read the poll question, the first one?
Sure. So we thought we'd make this a little bit more interactive by including some polls. So our first poll question, I'm going to go ahead and open it now. Does your agency or partner agency currently implement a targeted offender list?
So we'll go to our first slide, which is why establish lists. And we did have some questions come in related directly to this, but let's turn it over to our panel. And Dr. Decker, I'm going to start with you. You've researched, you've written books about it, and you continue to provide assistance for many agencies around the country on creating offender lists. What do you see are some of the benefits from your experiences?
Well, the obvious one is a way to concentrate resources that for all of us are limited, whether it's money or personnel or equipment. We face challenges of limited resources, and a targeted offender list is a way to focus those resources on the group of individuals responsible for the most serious crime. And that's not only is it an effective strategy, but it's a good way to use resources I think it's important to point out as well that one of the consequences of developing and implementing a targeted offender list is it really builds the team out. It has a variety of individuals interact, both community members and within criminal justice, who may not interact on a regular basis or on a focus on a specific problem. And while that's not the reason why we develop a list, it's one of those positive benefits that I think occurs as a consequence of developing a list. And we all know that partnerships can be much more effective ways of addressing problems than an individual agency trying to go it alone, if you will.
Great. Thanks, Scott. Turn to you, Captain. Tampa is a go-to model agency with your approach. Tell us about it and what led your PD to develop the model that you have.
Yeah, so back in 2015, we had a precipitous increase in gun violence out in the community. We saw a 29% increase in gun violence. Fortunately, I was tasked with putting together a group, which became the Violent Crime Bureau. We formed in November of 2015. And what we realized is we had to identify who the serial trigger pullers were. You know, who is it in your community and our community that are driving the violence? You know, so we came up with our methodology, which we call the Violent Impact Player list. And then we use that to identify our serial trigger pullers. And then we utilize the resources of the whole department and our partners with the U.S. Attorney's Office, ATF, FBI, and our county sheriff's office and Florida Department of Law Enforcement office. And we go out and we target these offenders in any means necessary.
Thanks, Captain, for that overview. Dr. Fox, you were on the ground floor with Tampa, and I know that agencies from around the country will ask you for your assistance and direction with creating lists. Do you have anything to add about the benefits and challenges from your perspective?
Well, one big benefit of this is, as Dr. Decker mentioned, the strategic focus on the prolific offenders will make the reduction in crime more noticeable. This is what our evaluation research shows, that by addressing those people in particular, it takes actually less agency resources and will make a bigger impact on your overall numbers of violent crimes. But I will say that just in general, one benefit of what the Tampa Police Department did was collaborating with a research partner. And something I always suggest is doing that because you want to know if your strategy is working. And something that I think Tampa Police Department has done and done so well over the years is always wanting to make sure that what they're doing is working and then changing it if it's not. And even when a strategy starts off as working, you might need to tweak it if it's not as effective over time or as new issues and changes take place. So I think that was something that they did really, really well, and I was thrilled to be part of it.
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate it. Okay, so a challenge that we've seen and was raised in some of the questions that came in is how to police address creating lists and the perception from some of what that means, and that the list could be used inappropriately, and also that from community members, but also the legal concerns with this. We're going to touch on that later, but it is a challenge, obviously. So our next topic, our next slide involves implementation considerations and a criteria discussion. Juliana, do you want to give the group the next poll question, please?
Sure. I'm working to load the next poll question now. This one's going to focus on whether you've established specific criteria for your targeted offender list. So I'm going to go ahead and open that at this time.
So this slide, the considerations, I'm going to touch on it at first since it relates to some experiences I've had when I've been asked to assist with going to various agencies to assess their offender list-based approaches due to them not being as effective or as they hoped or as effective as they once were, which goes to the lack of sustainment. So what I found with doing these assessments is that you can usually identify three key elements that are not in place or being well addressed at least, even before you go on site. And these key elements that I've seen and with the assessments and the reports I've done come down to leadership. Is it really a priority from the top of the organization or just an idea of the day? Who's in charge of it? So not just leadership that the department, the agencies are going to do this. And when I say leadership, I mean from a multitude of agencies. But is the agency creating and customizing the approach based upon their capacities and goals, or just trying to cut and paste from what others have done, which is typically a recipe that it won't sustain? And then secondly, are the right offenders being identified, which goes to criteria? And then lastly, and I think almost universally most important, if the agency has implemented a list approach, is what operations are they putting in place? What follow-up? So what is actually being done with the lists? And that's often not addressed early on. So again, with some of the best approaches that I've seen involving collaboration and leadership from many agencies, the concept stage of creating a list to the operational strategies on what to do with them must involve multiple partners. The police departments are typically the ones who design the approach, but federal, local, state, probation and parole should be involved when appropriate, and even your communities. So a couple examples. So the targeted offender approach I was involved with had very strong leadership from our chief, but especially our U.S. Attorney's Office, who brought all of the federal partners to the table, and we literally had the regional supervisor of IRS involved at one point. The key was that we established clear roles and expectations with each agency on what to do with the lists. We see from around the country very successful approaches. In Alabama, U.S. Attorney Jay Town, who I just spoke with this morning, has led a targeted offender approach where collaborative efforts have led to some of the most violent offenders being disrupted or taken off the street. Jay just said that currently they went from, in Huntsville, Alabama, 30 homicides to 19 in 2019, which is significant. And subsequently, all other violent crime went down by them targeting their top 10 offenders. He told me that they've taken 34 out of the 44 people on the list off the streets. And he said this couldn't have been done without all of their law enforcement partners. Their impacts that they've seen since they launched the approach, every individual on the initial top 10 priority offender list was dealt with, intervened in a relatively short period of time. And in New Orleans, they established teams to address their offenders, and federal agencies were assigned to these teams. Assistant Chief Paul Noel developed their approach after having a peer exchange with Milwaukee Police Department. So, Captain, with leadership, as it goes to organizational commitment and dedication, can you talk about your experiences and recommendations, please?
Yes. Fortunately, in Tampa, we had extremely positive support from our executive staff, the mayor's office, from the community, and from the U.S. Attorney's Office and our state attorney's office. What we found is that organizational change and flexibility is critical. If you have to have an offender list, if you're going to have an offender list, you have to have a way to go out and actually execute the list and attack these offenders. So we were willing to make changes. Our executive staff was willing to make changes within the organization, which dramatically helped us be more successful. A lot of agencies have bureaucratic silos, and they're unwilling to break those down. We were able to break through that at the Tampa Police Department, and now everybody in the organization understands the importance of gun crime in our city, and we get the full support of every component of the department. Just an example, we were having about 12-month turnaround on our NIBIN leads. We sent it to the state lab. It would take about 12 months for them to get back. So I asked the chief, I said, Chief, NIBIN is critical now for identifying serial trigger pullers. Within 2 weeks, he came up with the money to buy me the $250,000 NIBIN machine. So that's the type of support that we've got at Tampa, and I believe that's absolutely critical for success.
Thanks, Paul. And you had mentioned to me before, since Tampa's gotten a lot of recognition, you have people coming to see you to try and develop their approaches after yours. But you had mentioned to me the importance of how you apply it and do what is needed in the organization. Is that fair to say that you've seen some agencies come but really not dive in with the leadership or the approach that they need for their organization, and they just try and copy what you're doing?
Yeah, so we have had, it's very humbling, but we have had multiple agencies either ask us to go visit them or come down to Tampa. I think they actually prefer to come to Tampa, and but what they call me back is they say, we're having such problems inside our organization getting our executive staff to make the changes. So that is critical. If there's any executive staff members on the call here, you have to be willing to make that change.
And that goes to a point. I see a question just came in about the importance of organizational change, adapting to this. And from my experience, definitely we had to dedicate a lot of detectives to our approach, which didn't go over easy at first. And I know Kansas City, when they developed their approach, they totally restructured part of their violent crime division. So appreciate that. Okay, criteria. Let's talk about that. The question came in, what criteria is used to identify the offenders which will be placed on the targeted offender list? And from my experience, criteria will vary, but it's very important to establish. And some examples that we've seen of offender lists, we're talking about violent crime offenders right now, but we've also seen agencies use offender lists for those individuals causing what they determined was social disorder and impacting police resources. Domestic abuse offenders, Chula Vista, California is a really good program with domestic abuse. Narcotics traffickers and users, burglars, sex offenders. But again, we're focusing on violence typically with this. Dr. Fox, you and I are currently working on an SPI project in Pasco, Florida that's somewhat unique and involves identifying and intervening on both violent offenders and opioid dealers and users. Can you discuss some considerations with establishing criteria, whether it's related to what they're doing or your other experiences?
Yeah, one of the biggest things we wanted to do, and this was based upon Tampa Police Department, and that was also based upon the Los Angeles Police Department's LASER program, but we wanted to make sure there were objective risk factors that we knew were indicators of the outcome, which was either being a violent offender, an opioid user, a prolific offender, but that we were basically looking at things that were behavioral. So these are things that people choose to do and they can choose not to do, but also increase the risk of that exact outcome. And so through looking at research that's been done, we were able to come up with these risk factors and put them together and weigh them out appropriately, so we knew that people who have not just one, but actually a multitude of risk factors are the ones that are getting on these lists. And this was really important for a few reasons. One is we wanted to make sure that our risk factors were evidence-based. So we didn't just pull them out of thin air, that they were based upon academic research that had been replicated and that we really felt confident in. The second thing is we wanted to make sure there were objective factors that we could, say are applied for everybody. And the third thing was we wanted to make sure they were behavioral, so anybody who was on the list knew what they could not do and change their behavior, and in time be removed from the list, so it wasn't a permanent thing.
Thanks, Brianna. Dr. Decker, any additional thoughts on the importance of criteria and particularly who we should consider being involved when determining it?
Yeah, I think the point that's been made is the list needs to be outcome-focused is really important. If we're trying to change shooting or domestic violence or opiate dealing or disorder, that problem has to be clearly identified, agreed to by all the participants, and well-defined. It's also possible to identify a problem where we're not able to be effective against it, to develop a strategy, to implement that strategy, and see that after a few months, maybe we've got the wrong strategy, or maybe we've got the wrong program, the wrong problem, rather. I also think there's utility. I know one of the questions has asked about challenges to the validity of the list. There's utility in involving the community at some point. Sensitive law enforcement discussions, sharing of individually named data obviously is not the point at which that takes place, but bringing the community in to let them know this is what we're doing, and here's why we're doing it, and here's the evidence on which we're building this response. How can you help us with this? You know, and Dr. Fox spoke about building a list based on empirical criteria and research, and it raises the question that most jurisdictions face, and that is, do we allow nominations to get on the list? Yeah, you've got your list based on arrests or people who were charged or probation violations or people who had charges dropped and the prosecutor wouldn't go forward with the gun case. But here's this individual who we've had in custody 20 or 30 times that everybody, including community members, know is creating mayhem on the streets. Can we take a look at them? And those are challenges that you face down the road. And to sort of point ahead to a topic we're going to talk about, sustainability, which all of us feel very strongly about. Engaging the community at some point is going to lay the groundwork for a sustainable intervention.
Great. So I think that the criteria discussion leads to our next topic as well, which is legal considerations, and I incorporate transparency with this. It relates to some of the questions that have come in as well from the audience. So how have offender lists been challenged in court? What are the results? Is the creation of the target list discoverable to bias? So I want to start with Dr. Fox on some of her perspective and experiences with how objectivity and transparency in the application are critical elements to know about and for the public's perception. So, Doctor?
One of the things that has come up, especially recently, is bias in policing or perceptions of bias in policing. It doesn't have to be actual. And so one way that you can address this is by saying we're not, picking and choosing who makes it on the list. The same criteria are applied to everybody, and anybody who is on the list, met that bar, and we're not, selectively choosing people. So that's part of the objectivity side. I think that there's really only two ways that we can go about making a list, and one is subjective in nature, where we, pick and choose based upon our past experience, and I think that has a place in all of this, and we can talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But the other way is a very objective approach, where it's numerical, where it's statistical and more scientific. And I think while there's no perfect answer, the second option prevents some perceptions of bias and prevent some issues that we don't want to deal with from occurring. I think in terms of using our officer's experience, that certainly has a role, and you want that for buy-in among your law enforcement that are going to be using the list. But one way to do that is when you're developing the list, bouncing some of these ideas off of them, making sure that the things that we're using as the risk factors are seeming like they apply. An example is gang affiliation is a strong risk factor for violence and gun violence. But if you live in a jurisdiction where there is not very much, gang affiliation, or if the gangs are more hybrid, or they're not exactly a straight-up street gang, that might not be a great criteria to use. So those types of things, by involving your people, will be helpful. But at the end of the day, the criteria are applied for everybody. And then in terms of transparency, I think that it's important not to feel like you need to hide the list. I think that by getting community buy-in from the beginning is really helpful to making sure everybody feels like you're proud of it and that there's nothing, that you're hiding behind. And in fact, the same thing is being applied to everybody, and that we don't have to worry about any bias occurring.
So that's a good segue into just a quick discussion on the legal considerations. And I'm not a lawyer, but I've been sued by offenders on lists, and I'm actually still being sued by one currently. And there are many people on this call right now who are experts in the law and know much about the legalities of lists. But I can share my perspective, and I don't believe there's a real need to talk right now about 28 CFR, the federal regulation, but we did include a reference to it in our resource slide. So from my experience and perspective, police use lists all the time, but when it involves people, we need to be aware that there's concerns that can be expressed, and some of this is rightfully based upon historical practices that weren't good. It does remain a societal topic, and there was a recent article in the New York Times on predictive algorithms and concerns about how they're being used to calculate probability of future events. So it is a present issue, and Dr. Fox brought up the importance of being transparent with this. And to me, it's quite simple. The purpose and goal for creating offenders lists are to be used just as tools for police to implement strategies with a goal to reduce crime. My perspective, and I think Brandon suggested this, if you're using intelligence and data, meaning your lists are evidence-based, the behavior of people, which is what the key is, the lists will actually create themselves. So I'm not going to do a deep dive into the approach that my agency used, but I think it's worth talking about because of the legality portion of this discussion. We had a very comprehensive and collaborative offender selection process, and it's been upheld in federal court. So we established a selection committee for our offender list, and the committee involved police, ATF, U.S. attorneys, district attorneys, probation and parole, and community members. Our selection committee did not know the names or races of those. It was based upon their history and the behavior and police intelligence. We actually had the media sit down on our process when we first launched. And then when the first offender sued, the Seventh Circuit Court in Chicago upheld that our process was not discriminatory, and the court did not support the offender's claim that they were deprived of liberty or stigmatized by being on a list. So that was interesting, and I think that it goes to some of the questions that are coming in as well on research, our next topic. So just quickly, I won't read the question, but they involve one involves methods for developing and maintaining lists. What are practical ways to enlist the community engagement and support for focusing enforcement on a small number of individuals? So it goes to what you talked about a little bit, Dr. Decker, already, but just can you respond directly to the question about, is there research on best practices that for violent offenders being targeted? For example, a top 20 list. Is it valuable to share this with the community, or more beneficial to keep it confidential? And I'm assuming it's case by case. But what are your thoughts, Scott?
It's case by case, and a lot of it is defined by the relationship with the community. You know, one of the complaints I hear from communities is we get told what's going to happen to us. We don't get to participate or provide feedback to that. And, you know, if you have a friend, if you have a relationship with someone, they go to your house and you go to their house. And so simply inviting community members into that often forbidding federal building in the big city is not enough. That it's essential for persons in the criminal justice system to go into the community and meet with community members. Most cities have citizens groups that are engaged in either crime prevention or community organization. Many cities, tragically, have mothers groups comprised of mothers who have lost a child to violence that meet regularly. I've seen communities, and Kansas City was one, where they were the greatest ally of and support for a list identifying either, as some cities have done, who's a likely violent offender, but also who's a likely victim. And, you know, when we prevent a violent crime, when we prevent a shooting, it's important to keep in mind that there's both the shooter, but there's also the potential victim who themselves and their family are spared the heartache and expense and trauma of being a shooting victim. Just one final minor point I want to make about lists. One of the best defenses to the legitimacy of a list is having an exit strategy. How do you get off the list? If you can get on, how do you get off? And certainly it varies. Some jurisdictions have a time limit. a year, 18 months, 2 years. Other jurisdictions have said when an individual goes to prison or if they move out of the jurisdiction, then they can be off the list. So it's important to keep in mind that this isn't a list that just grows and grows and grows. It's a list that's got people going in and people coming off because there's just a finite amount of resources available to law enforcement in a community, and they may be able to deal with 20 or 40 or 50, but 200 or 500 or 1,000 would overwhelm the system.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate that. So let's move on to the last topic on this slide, research partners. And a question came in. What role, if any, should the academic research partner have in constructing and maintaining the target offender list? So just talk about research partners in general. Captain, let's start with a police officer rather than our two researchers. Tampa dove in with Dr. Fox. How did your partnership with her start? And share with the group the benefits of having a research partner involved, especially from the start of the implementation.
Yeah, so back in 2015, we were meeting with our partners at the U.S. Attorney's Office, ATF, Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, St. Petersburg, and we were trying to form a regional CJIC, Crime Gun Intelligence Center. And immediately we looked around the room. We said, well, something's missing. We need a research partner. Everybody in the room realized the importance of bringing somebody from the outside, not affiliated with law enforcement, just to make sure we were on the right track. So before we held our next meeting, we reached out to University of South Florida, and fortunately we got involved with Dr. Fox, and we've had a fantastic relationship since then. We've won 4 grants since our partnership started, and we've included the USF in every one of those grants as a committed research partner. One thing I found is we've been very successful in the Tampa Police Department. We've reduced crime 80% since I started in 1990. But a lot of times you don't know what we did, if it worked or not. And I think sometimes egos get in the way. They don't want to know what works or doesn't work because they don't want to be proven wrong. But our group realized, hey, we could be going down the wrong road real quick. So we checked our egos and we brought somebody in that could critique us and make sure we were on the right track. And it's been a fantastic relationship ever since.
That's great. That's great. And Dr. Fox, I know you were a former FBI agent, so you understand the law enforcement culture, but cops can be tough with not letting others in. How did it go when you started with Tampa, and any other examples with working with police agencies?
Well, I did have some law enforcement experience, so that certainly helps. But I think for other research partners that don't, it's not that wasn't the one thing. The thing that I always try to rely on is exactly what Captain Lewinsky said. You want to know, for the sake of your community and for your department, if what you're doing is working. And for researchers, I know we can have a bad name sometimes in terms of, we're going to take these results that show your thing didn't work, and we're going to publish it all over the place. And I think just making sure the police department knew that, and I always say this to them, if there's bad news, I'll tell it to them directly. If there's good news, I'll tell it to everybody. And so I always want to make sure that it's clear. I'm not going to not tell them if it's bad. I'm going to tell them if it doesn't work and how we can fix it. But when it is good and it's important that everybody knows that this is a product that's working, I think it's beneficial that everybody is aware that this is something that can be used and will be successful.
Thank you, Doctor. So let's move on to the next slide, Juliana, and touch on some operational considerations. We don't have to dive into this too deep, but we've mentioned a key to the success in obtaining your desired goals and getting the impacts that you want is, what are you going to do with the list? Who gets the list? What happens to it or should happen to it? What happens when the offenders on the list reoffend? From patrol to P&P and ultimately to prosecutions, the networking that's involved. And Captain, you have your list with what Tampa does with it, and can you talk about what you do with it? How did you share the intelligence, and maybe some experiences involving your partnerships and especially your prosecutors' offices?
Yes. So we've put our list together, and it's available to every individual in the Tampa Police Department, either through a desktop or through the mobile dispatch terminals in every police car. So we want everybody in the police department to be aware of who our serial trigger pullers are. We put a lot of information on that Excel spreadsheet, and it's ready and available to everybody. We also share the list with all of our partners, federal probation and parole, state probation and parole, the U.S. Attorney's Office, state Attorney's Office, at FBI. We share it with everybody. You know, and I can't say enough for our relationship with our U.S. Attorney's Office. From the start, they were fantastic partners with us, and we've been strong. We were with them when it was KG, and then it transitioned to PSN. And that relationship, they told me they waived the criteria. Somebody's on my VIP list. They feel so strongly about it, they'll waive the criteria, and they'll take them for us. So that partnership has been absolutely fantastic. But sharing information, not hoarding it, is the key to success.
Great, thank you. And just a discussion that we want to have on the list and managing the list, because that's often something that goes unchecked. And I did some work with New Orleans, and that was one of their issues is, all right, how are we keeping this list fresh? How do we know that the people on the list are still relevant? What are we doing to put that in place? So it is a very important topic, and I'm just going to throw it out to Scott and Brianna for their insights on managing the lists and any experiences that you've had with best practices. Scott?
Where I've seen lists be used most effectively, they have been carefully managed, and often a crime analyst within the police department, especially in a larger department that has real strengths in their crime analysis unit, maintains the list because they have direct access, and know of the data sources within the police department. In smaller jurisdictions, without the luxury of a larger crime analysis unit, researchers or their graduate students have managed the list. And I want to just bounce back to the function of the list real quickly. One of the most impressive uses of a list I've seen was for officer safety. And whenever one of the 20 worst of the worst individuals bounced up, when an officer ran an individual through the RMS, would have worst of the worst in big letters across the screen on the face sheet of their information in the record management system, so that the officer knew not only that this was a person of some interest to a variety of criminal justice people in the community, but it was someone they should be extra careful in approaching. So I think there are a number of ways to get the list managed, and it may take a little experimentation. Often there is a crime analyst who's really interested in linking across different data sets, and they would be a good choice for managing the list.
Yeah, to complement that, I think from the experiences I've seen, it's often good to have a non-sworn person manage the list, somebody that will be there in that position for a longer period of time with all the transition that sworn officers tend to make. It's not a mandate, but I think it's a good practice. So, Brianna, anything, I know one of the questions came in, and Scott touched on it, was about once you're on the list, are you on the list forever? I'm just going to turn it over to you about any thoughts you have on managing lists and that topic as well.
The big thing is you have to give an exit strategy, which we've already discussed, but I think that also putting time frames on all of the elements that you're using for your risk inclusion factors, and making sure that you have somebody routinely updating it. So I think in Tampa it's weekly, other places have done it every 90 days, but that way you also make sure it's fresh. And one thing I've seen with other agencies I've worked with, they want to look over, their entire, criminal histories that's in the past, decade, to see who might fit this list. One thing that Tampa did that I thought was really smart is say, we're going to limit it down just to the past 2 years. And that way you get the most recent, fresh people out there. You're not looking at somebody who cumulatively may have committed a dozen or more crimes over 10 years, but that's not the same as somebody who committed a dozen crimes in the past 2 years. And so that person, the more recent person, is obviously going to rise up higher, or they should, and receive more attention. So I think there's different strategies to make sure we're focusing on the right people and then get the wrong people or the people that are maybe a little outdated off our list.
Okay, great. And Paul, I was going to ask you, but we're going to press for time a little bit. If my understanding is your crime analyst manages your list. Is that correct?
Yeah, she looks at it weekly. We want it to be very fresh, very fluid, and we want the most aggressive trigger pullers that are active in our community on it right now.
Makes sense. All right, Juliana, let's move on to the last slide to talk about impacts and sustainment. And sustainment is always a challenging topic, and the only thing I have to say on it is it goes to demonstrating what the impacts are, both internally and externally. If you get the community to support what you're doing based upon making the community safer, it's easier. If you get your agency to understand that this is benefiting them, you're dealing with likely to deal less with the same people over and over again, and that they're getting held more accountable because they're on this list, it goes a long ways. But I want to turn it over to the panel. And I'll start with the people that love to measure things, because that's what you do as researchers. Dr. Fox and Dr. Decker, Brianna, you can start. Can you just talk about, how do you know if the interventions are successful, and how can agencies best sustain what they're doing?
I think this is one of the biggest benefits of having a research partner, is that somebody who is independent and objective can do that and say whether it's working. We use all different types of strategies, which require sharing data with us. But like I said before, if you have a good long-term collaboration with a research partner, where it's a two-way street of trust and collaboration, then hopefully that's something that everybody will be happy to do. I think that it's also really important that we make sure we are doing long-term evaluations. One thing that we've seen recently is there are effects that may last a year or 2 years, but as time goes on, does the effects still last? And that relates to sustainability as well. The inverse of the effect not lasting is it sustainable? And so having that research partner to do those long-term follow-ups, which frankly law enforcement does not need to be tasked with, and it's our pleasure to do. And then in terms of sustainability, I think just making sure from the front end that research partners who may say, you should include all these measures and you should do all these different things, it's important for us to tell each other, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We might want that, but is it sustainable? Keeping something that's more simplistic, straightforward, will lend itself to more sustainability over time, and I think that's really important over the long term.
Scott, anything to add to that?
No one likes to deliver bad news, and researchers generally and research partners are often in the position of coming back to the group and saying, this doesn't look like we're getting the outcomes we had hoped for or expected. And it was one of the highlight moments for me to come back and report, as a member of the team, that we couldn't detect any effect on the individuals who were on the list and crime overall. And the captain in charge of the violent crime unit said, that's the most valuable information we can get. We have limited resources, and we can only spend those resources on things that are producing an effect. So we always want to know what is and what isn't working. And I think this calls attention to an important distinction that research partners should make between outcomes that reflect a process and outcomes that reflect an impact. It may be that X number of people were arrested and the team met this many times and criteria were developed and probation was revoked in 8 or 10 cases, but the real measure we're interested in is, did those actions have an impact on crime? Did they reduce the levels of violent crime in a neighborhood and in a gang, in certain individuals or a group? And that focus on impact on crime is something to keep in mind, and a good research partner will be able to help do that.
Thanks, Scott. Now, Captain, so your sustainment with Tampa, your Tampa approach is proven. let me ask you, do you think it is based upon the organizational understanding and acceptance of what you're doing, your leadership indicating, hey, this is the way we're going to do it, or is it both, if you can comment?
Yeah, so I think every year we have a deployment meeting right around September, and resources at the Tampa Police Department are gold just like at any other agency. And it's always a struggle at that table to maintain your resources, and it's even harder to build on them. And when the chief and his staffs and the mayor started seeing the results that we were having, with our focused approach, it was very easy for us to sustain. We had a 47% reduction in gun crime and a 51% reduction in non-fatal shootings. And we're always flexible. Every year we come to the table, we see what's in front of us. As things change, we change our plan and we move forward. And I think that's why we've been able to maintain our stability through all this.
Perfect. Okay, so we are going to try and address some of the questions that have come in since we launched the webinar. I've got to tell you, it's pretty fantastic, but there's no way we're going to get to all of these. I think we're up to like 21 questions right now, which is just great. But we'll address a couple of the questions, time permitting, and then I'll turn it over to Juliana to wrap up and talk about the poll results and resources. So I think it's a great question, and I think I could talk about this for a while, but I want to turn it to the researchers. The question is, if a researcher shows that there is not statistically significant reduction in violent crime, does it suggest the program is a failure? For example, the evaluations NSU did on focused deterrence.
I'm going to give you a researchy answer, not necessarily. The question I would ask is, how thoroughly was the program implemented? We know that implementation is a key to success. If you were building a bridge over a river and you were 90% successful, the bridge wouldn't carry traffic. You've got to make sure interventions are implemented fully and according to design. And that also includes giving them time to work. Look, most communities that have high levels of violent crime didn't get there overnight. And they're not going to get out of those problems overnight. There's going to need to be continued focus of multiple kinds of resources and community cooperation, all things easy to say and hard to do. So, I wouldn't give up too quickly on the one hand. On the other hand, a well-done evaluation that is several months, a year or more down the road without producing any positive results suggests it's time to tweak the evaluation or look for something new.
And I will add to that response, Scott, because this question was an issue that came up with the program that we had. And we chose not to look at overall reduction in violent crime because we thought that was just too difficult and setting ourselves up for failure. So we evaluated the reduction that the offenders on our list did. Pre-intervention felonies, pre-intervention shootings, post-intervention on the list. And so we were able to demonstrate, hey, there's going to be tangential impacts on overall violent crime by getting the worst of the worst intervened, but you can't make that assumption that that's going to have a universal impact right away. So that's based on the experience I had. Captain, I'll ask you this one. So when you refresh the list, do you remove those from the previous list?
So ours is a scoring system. So if we rescore you and you don't have the mandatory points to get on the list, you drop off. So it's a constant list. We only have 50 people on it, but it's the highest 50 scorers. So if, for instance, you come off probation and you lose the points that we give to probationers, you drop down and you're no longer on the list.
All right. I'm going to ask Dr. Fox this, and I'll throw my 2 cents in here. The question is, how do crime analysts tie into the process of developing lists? And just from my perspective, they're very critical and important, but they cannot be the only source, or they should not be, from my experience, of gathering intelligence on who belongs on the list. I think a more comprehensive overview, I like agencies who get direct feedback from patrol officers and detectives who are out in the field as to who's driving the crime. It all still has to come down to behavior. But Brianna, the significance of crime analysis into the list development.
Yeah, exactly what you said, Tom, but I think that the crime analyst is just absolutely essential when it comes to maintaining the list and doing, if you're going to do it like we did, scoring people out. I have seen it both ways, where it's been not done with a crime analyst and then done with a crime analyst, and I think it's just so much easier, better. It's what they're trained for and what they're really excited about doing. And so I strongly support it, and I was a former crime analyst, so I think that would have been something I would have really enjoyed if I had the opportunity to be part of it.
Thanks, Brianna. Well, I feel bad. There's a lot of great questions here, and we'll work on, I think, Juliana, we should work on having the panel respond to these, and if we can post them somewhere or respond to the people who ask them, because I find them very educational as well. So with that, I'm gonna end our panel discussion portion and thank you all for joining, especially during the COVID issue that we're all facing, and to stay safe and healthy. And Julianne, I'll turn it over to you to wrap up now. Thanks.
Sure. So a few people have asked about the webinar recording. That'll be available on the PSN TTA website, and I'll also try to send it out to everyone who registered. So on the next slide, we just have a few of the additional resources that were mentioned during the conversation, and then there were a couple questions that came up about particular legal citations that we'll work on getting folks that information. So to wrap up the polling, so we had, for those who said that their agency responded to the question about the agencies having a violent offender list, 57% of you who responded said yes, and 43% said no. So it sounds like those are in varying stages of implementation, and 61% indicated that they had specific criteria for a violent offender list. So that just to give you an idea of the polling results. Well, with that, we want to thank everyone for taking the time out. On the next slide, you'll see our psntta.org website, which is where the full webinar recording will be posted. And then you can also reach out to the team at psntta@psntta.org. And like Tom said, we're going to work on getting those questions, answers to those questions from the panel out to you. You had so many good questions, and we weren't able to answer all of them. So again, thank you very much to everyone for joining, and we look forward to seeing you on our next PSN TTA webinar. Thanks.